Hello, my name is Jeffrey Campbell, and today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of putting people first in operational planning and how this will yield much faster results than doing things the other way around. So, when I talk about putting people first, what I'm really talking about is intuitively using your own feelings to build a team. If you use your own intuitions and feelings about what motivates you to come to work every day, then you'll know the distinction between engagement and motivation. One question I always ask people is, does money really affect your motivation? And actually, there's a great amount of research in this, and someone with a Harvard Business Review actually took the steps of putting it all together to come with a definitive answer. Kind of curious to know what your idea is in regards to if money really affects motivation. I'm sure that with your own answer, you probably didn't say that's the first thing that affects performance. In fact, when I do this training with large groups of people, I ask about what motivates them to come to work each day, and it doesn't matter if they're executives or beginning hospitality employees. Money is rarely the first thing they mention. Usually it's the same points of engagement that the guests have as well. They're really shared, and a lot of that has to do with the service culture. There is a difference between motivation and engagement. Motivation's a noun. The reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. Some synonyms I have listed here is motive, motivating force, incentive, stimulus, inspiration. I do think that there's a bigger distinction between motivation and engagement. Engagement is defined as engagement is the emotional commitment the employee has to the organization and its goals. This emotional commitment means engaged employees actually care about their work and their company. They don't work just for a paycheck or just the next promotion, but work on behalf of the organizational goals. And again, I have a nice article from Forbes that I'll put at the end of this if you want to do your own research and engagement. So definitely different there. The operative word when we're looking at motivation and engagement is emotion. Emotion drives individuals. Emotion drives purchasing decisions. Emotion drives behaviors and expectations. Emotion affects the willingness to change or the fear not to change. Emotion is the basic fuel for engagement as both a customer and an employee. There's a cool Skift report that I was reading actually about measuring engagement of guests at a ski resort. And long story short, it all has to do with appealing to the emotions. If they can have an emotional memory that's engaging, that'll stay with them for life, and it creates loyalty. Same thing goes for an employee, right? So that begs the question, do we treat all employees like our guests? Should we? Well, if you would look at Isidore Sharp, Bill Marriott, Branson, all these leaders have something in common, and it is basically their service philosophy to their employees. And what you'll see is the commonality is that employees are as important as the guests, sometimes more so, but they're definitely an important construct there. And the best way to start thinking about the people process is by talking about these emotions. So what motivates you to come to work and do a great job each day? What's your engagement? What's your level of engagement? Do you see the difference? And again, this comes back to the money. It's not always about the money, but we'll talk about that later as we talk about each step of the people process. If we start with you, the leader, then we can make wise decisions about any company. I would say with confidence the following: the people process determines the success or failure of all businesses, from one employee to thousands. There are numerous well-known studies and journals and theses and books with peer group evaluated data supporting this statement. So it's not just a subjective statement we're throwing out there, but it's something that there's a desire to study, and it has been studied, and the evidence is shows a strong correlation with this in regards to the importance of the people process. In fact, there are many sources in popular culture which you might be familiar. You've heard names like Jim Collins, he wrote Good to Great, Built to Last even before that, Stephen Covey, Robert Greenleaf, John Maxwell, the list goes on. And then there's several of which may be unfamiliar, but it depends on how deep you want to dive in. And all of these studies are accessible on all legs of your learning journey, because none of us really know everything there is to know about the people process. And as we change our organizations and we change the platform, there's always things that we can learn about the people process and how this can influence the changes we're trying to do operationally. So one of the things I like to discuss is putting first things first, and we'll put this into perspective. Let's face it, the hospitality industry is one of many details in performance planning at all levels. From the execution of the arrival experience, even before that, the reservations experience, the pre-planning experience, the online experience, all the way through the stay, the departure, and how we keep that guest engaged. It's the same thing that I'd like to argue about employees. The people process concept precedes leadership materials focusing on execution, organizational structure, financial literacy, etc., because regardless of what leadership approach you decide on taking, you'll ultimately fail if you don't plan the people process first, starting with yourself as the leader. Identify the various stages of the people process. Okay, so there's definitely different stages in the life cycle of an employee. They have to be interested in the organization. They have to know that an opportunity is available. Either they're approached by somebody or maybe they've noticed, but in any case, the dragnet was out and you're collecting the best possible candidates for the position. And when we're talking about this, we're laying out the framework for transparency in the whole people process. And this is one of the main concepts that I like to talk about, is transparency and trust. In the people process, it starts from the very beginning that there's transparency. Great leaders don't keep their toolboxes to their chest. They don't keep them locked away. They share as much as they possibly can based on the level of trust with their employees about how things work at each stage of the journey. The more your team knows about how you define success, performance, key performance indicators, MBOs, management by objectives, there's lots of ways of looking at these metrics. Ultimately, your goals, the more you'll be able to be an effective leader. Effective leaders always produce results, right? I mean, that's where the operative word here is effective. Effective leadership. I define this as the leader's ability to manage change and create a collective balanced scorecard of sustained performance over time, right? They're looking at the future. They're not looking too much in the rearview mirror, but certainly with the frequency and severity of things that happen as a good operator, you're not going to want to repeat the same mistakes multiple times. However, the best leaders are always looking ahead, and they're looking for ways that they can improve performance and sustain performance over the long term. So that's effective leadership. Communicating the people process. Again, I mentioned transparency just a moment ago. It's got to be abundant at each stage in the process. First impressions count with our guests. So then obviously they do for our potential employees, current employees and former employees. Transparency means without a doubt that each person you come into contact with within each of these stages of employment know the following. They'll know the company culture, they'll know your departmental culture, they know their job description, they know the terms of employment, including the benefits. They know where they stand, not just on an annual or a quarterly basis, but every single day. And I might remind you, this has to do with tracking the sourcing and selection process. They need to know, hey, am I still a candidate here? You know, am I shortlisted? Their time is as valuable as your time. What are the expectations of the job and the specific performance? And what behaviors are expected from the candidates as it relates to the code of conduct? Finally, what outcomes are we expecting from their job performance? What are the goals? So the first part of this whole people process is sourcing and selecting, right? We kind of mentioned this briefly, you know, when we're looking for the best available talent. There are a few things that must be done before you set out to hire another employee. You may feel the stress on the operation when you're in need of another person. In fact, your team will probably feel the stress even more. But unless you take the time to plan, you're putting a lot at risk for your team, especially if you throw a bad apple in there and haven't considered the consequences of that action. You'll need to know what you need to turn into a job description. You'll have to find a way to articulate exactly what it is you're looking for. You'll need to know if you've created what I call a hybrid job. I've learned a lot about this at smaller or seasonal properties and boutiques. Sometimes you can't afford to have one FTE and another FTE doing separate tasks. Instead, you might need to have one FTE, that means full-time equivalent, doing a diversity of tasks that fall into other job descriptions. So you might have a hybrid, like I said, or if it's a more universally accepted position. The distinction is very important though, right? If you hire someone from a universal background for a universal position, but the job's a hybrid and vice versa even, you have a potential conflict to solve, which goes beyond their previous performance indicators. You'll need to determine the probability of the candidate's success based on their innate talents, transferable skills, and ability to adapt. In other words, it's not just sink or swim, it's all about fit as well. And when I mention the distinction between hybrid jobs and universally accepted jobs, I'm speaking of, like, for example, I'm looking for a banquet manager position, or hey, I'd really like to be a front office manager at that property, director of rooms, chief engineer, whatever the position is. There's kind of a general assumption when it's a universal position of what the scope of the position is. But it does change on the size of the property. A 1,000-room property chief engineer might wear suit and tie more than a 20-room boutique that might not have as robust of a maintenance or engineering department. Even the terms might be changed. These large companies, you have an engineering team, others have a maintenance team, and then sometimes it kind of blends together with housekeeping and facilities. It's really important to know those distinctions from the very get-go. Once you've articulated the job, you have to determine your market. In order to determine your market, you have to pursue employees with the same vigor as you would towards appealing to your guests. The competitive benefits for the level of recruiting desired for the specific position are very important. I know that I mentioned in the very beginning that it's not about the money, but when you're competitively sourcing a position, the job's pay scales can tell you a lot about the organization and about the investment you're looking for. What are the wow factors of joining your team? Why, when it's in a selection process and not an interviewing process, it's a two-way street. They're evaluating you and you're evaluating them. It's got to be a fit both ways. And who is this target, and what channels will you use to promote the job both internally and externally? I think later on we'll discuss team mapping and how to identify top performers that are poised for growth. These individuals should always be the top of mind in solving difficult or even simple staffing challenges. It will always be riskier to bring someone in from the outside versus selecting an employee internally with a track record of progressive improvement, solid engagement, and sustained performance. Keep in mind, the more specific the skill set, the more costly it'll be to recruit. Sometimes for some positions you have to use headhunters, you have to use recruiting agencies just to find the right person for the job because it's so specific. That's why it's so crucial to promote from within when you can. So in the interview and selection process, this follows the outreach, or basically trying to find the right candidates. This would be a great moment to discuss the importance of keeping track of everything. Okay? I'll continually remind you that you have agreed that the people process is the most valuable process in our operating platform. That's why you're listening today. We spend hours plying our trade on the floor, but routinely fail to put aside the time for performance planning. It's also human nature, right? I've never met a great general manager, rooms director, food and beverage director that didn't regret not spending enough time on the floor. Even if they're always on the floor, that's their bloodline. That's what they love doing. But we have to make sure that it's balanced. No one likes office time, but there's some things that we have to do when we plan. And performance planning starts with sourcing It never ends. Performance planning is a conversation throughout the whole lifespan of an employee. It's the hard work you must do to ensure everything else is a cakewalk, or at least appears a cakewalk, which that's important for guests and employees alike, that we make it look easy because it's so efficient. Interviewing and selection, it's also important to remember applicant tracking. Just like we track our interactions with our guests, we need to track the details associated with the interview process. Each time contact is made, we need to measure the time between each event so that we're keeping the fire alive in our potential employees and building trust with the external community. It is tedious and time consuming, but again, that's how great leaders lead. They keep score. So what should be standardized and what should be situational? So this was a question someone asked me, and I know that we're flying ahead here, but these are interview techniques. And you can read all about it on LinkedIn, Fast Company. The debate rages on in regards to what's the best type of interviews. There's even schools of thought that compare and contrast the pros and cons of talent-based organizations, emotional intelligence. Just like small boutique properties, stuff like that have hybrid positions, I'd like to invite you to try another hybrid approach to interviewing. So as I mentioned, there's debate in the intellectual community about the effectiveness of various interviewing techniques and styles. For those with a devoted interest in the people process, it can be daunting and discouraging, but it doesn't have to be. So we can start with a simple hybrid of standard questions and job-related questions. So we determine the organizational fit first. What motivates this person? What is their mission of service? If it's not serving others, then how can they possibly be hospitality professionals? Determine the departmental fit. Can they do the job? And a lot of this has to do with communication with your director of human resources in regards to what are the physical limitations of the job. And then there's intellectual challenges as well. What's the learning curve? Is it an entry-level position? What are the essentials? How much can you afford to contribute to their preparedness for success? Remember, raw talent is never enough. But remember, it's an investment in the people process that's worth making. So you can't just cross your fingers and hope sink or swim. Sometimes they do kind of swim, but that's not really setting people up for success. And if there's anything you can do to hasten that learning curve, then you're doing the organization and the team a favor as well. You might even carve out some extra hours for your own life balance. Determine the team fit. When you interview someone, have the rest of the team mapped out in your head or in your structured review process. Imagine how they'll interact with each person, both internally and externally. Your team is counting on you to make the right decisions every single time. So we've talked about the sourcing process, we've talked about selecting. The next stage in the journey is onboarding. This is a huge step which is often overlooked, even with the best of intentions. The best way to conceptualize the importance of onboarding is to examine the arrival experience of your guests. Whether it's in your restaurant, if it's in your banquet facility, your hotel, the first impressions, as you know, are lasting impressions. There's no difference when you're onboarding a new employee. Things that you can do, just like with announcing a site inspection. Make sure there's an announcement. Tell the world that who you've selected and what they'll be doing and how lucky we are to have them. Make sure they have the tools to do the job in advance. If they have business cards needs, communication needs, office space, computers, business cards. I know I mentioned that twice. These things are very important. And another aspect that's important with not just onboarding, but the work environment is what experts call hygiene factors. No, that's not cleanliness or how you smell specifically. It's the working order of the things you use on a daily basis to complete the tasks at hand. For example, you might have a tape dispenser without tape in it, a squeaky office chair, maybe your mouse doesn't work properly. Each one of these things individually might not destroy an employee's level of engagement, but collectively they can, you know, and there's always the straw that breaks the camel's back. So think it out before they get there. Make sure that their air conditioning is just like a guest room. everything's in working order, everything is clean, it smells great, it feels great, everything's laid out with their success in mind. If you do that, you can't lose. So with the training outline, this is another important step. This needs to be in hand before the first day. We're all human beings and we want to be successful. As much as it's something silly that we don't discuss, we all get jittery before our first day, right? So the best way to set someone up for success is just like planning an itinerary for a guest. You put it in their hands well in advance and they can practice. They can look through the list of names. They can memorize the names. They can make a great first impression themselves. Maybe they'll arrive to the office early. All of these things help them be successful because we're treating them like we are our most valued guest. They also need their job description in hand. Again, it's important. This is an important part of discussing their performance in their first 90 days. Their initial training schedule. Do it. It's a promise, and stick with it. This goes with meeting other leaders. It's a promise. Do it. Everyone needs to know that time with a new hire is as important as time with a potential paying guest. So when someone makes a commitment to meet with one of your new employees, you need to remind them that this is just as important as any other endeavor. So now we're going to talk about bridging the gap between high potential employees and top performing employees. If you did your homework and selected the best person, you've onboarded them like a perfect site inspection and provided a learning map for the initial 90 days. By the second quarter, they will have enhanced your team score by moving into your top box. And I'll talk about this later. But what we're really talking about is mapping your team's overall performance. So as we look at this, okay, so looking at this construct here, this would be how well they adhere to values, and this would be how well they do their job. And this is the top box. And of course it's backwards because of my recording device, but you want to get as many employees here as possible. It's not realistic with real large organizations to expect everyone to be in here, and sometimes it's not even necessary for the effectiveness of the department. However, you can look at the proportion of top performers versus everyone else, and this is a good metric in looking at the health of your organization and your department specifically. Okay, so when I talk about top box, just keep that in mind. That's what I'm talking about, is this quadrant right here, this little box, which is your top performer. So remember, for now, this transition involves ensuring that they remain engaged and supporting the team culture while improving their overall contributions. Because you've ensured that they have the right talents for the service industry and that they're the best fit for the culture, we all need to focus on training, and that's all we need to focus on. Training takes time. I'd hope within the first 90 days they know what they didn't know and can become a partner with you in growing their competitive edges within the department. If they're engaged and they're living our core values, then all you have to worry about is giving them the tools and then getting out of their way so they can be successful. Also remember that continuous feedback will yield continuous improvement. There are two people processes in particular which will yield the greatest return in human capital management. This would be what is commonly known as a review, and then less commonly known as a team mapping process. Reviews come in all shapes and sizes, but I'll tell you what, if you only spend that 30 minutes to an hour with each employee to go over an annual review, you're not going to win. It's a useless process. However, again, we talk about hybrids. If you include this process more periodically, then they always know where they are. The bottom line is they should always know where they stand. One process is an individualized approach to inspiring growth and outcomes, and the other is a collaborative approach to ensuring the highest level engagement from your team. Okay? So basically what I'm saying there is that you're looking at individual performance and recording it, and then mapping out your entire team, and then each individual employee knows where they stand in regards to the team map. That doesn't mean that you're going to share confidential information. It means that you can look at them specifically and where they stand and use real numbers to help them get to where they want to be. So we'll need to define the mission of service when we're defining performance. Mission of service is what, like I mentioned, what motivates you, what engages you to get up each day. In the service industry, it's all about serving people, right? It's in our blood. It's what we do. We really can't do much of anything else because we love serving people so much. You know, it's kind of funny. Company values are very important, and they can be measured and they can be tracked in the coaching process. Trust is doing what you say you're going to do. Think dependable on this as well. Work style results. What is your intensity? How do you get things done? What's the quality of your work? How flexible are you to find ways to make improvements? Relationships, how do you communicate? And are you doing it in a positive manner? Is there self-awareness in how you're managing day-to-day operations? Are you a good listener? There's other constructs based upon the scope of the position. It's helpful to know the capabilities of top performers in all levels of the organization, and expectations should be understood. For leadership roles, as an example, studies show that we can coach smaller teams more effectively than larger teams. This goes for all levels of the organization. This also displays the skill needed in large organizations to trickle down information to individual work groups. So if you have an executive team at a large property, you're still only going to have, anywhere from 6 to 12 maybe that's sitting there. Again, it all bases on structure. And then below that, you'll have a similar thing. What is not effective is having, say, let's say a director of housekeeping without any support and 40 to 60 full-time equivalents or room attendants. How are they possibly going to make the time to make that work? That's not setting them up for success. So when we discuss performance, we need to have a vocabulary that's understood universally. And we also need to know that the employees feel important to their supervisors. They need to be important, and it can't be artificial. It needs to be a true recognition of their importance. This means that there needs to be time set aside for individual coaching. Before I mention the constraints of larger teams, if you don't have the time, get a smaller group to focus on. This means you may need to potentially expand your leadership team so that each employee has an effective reporting relationship. Remember that your leadership team is charged with communicating the mission and vision of the organization with the same clarity and confidence as their leaders. So depending on what level of organization you're in, you're charged with ensuring that those concepts are reaching your reporting employees. And we all know that that's on employee opinion surveys. That's something we miss a lot, is the communication. And a lot of this has to do with just the science of our ability to focus, the locus of control or something like that they call it. It's like 7 people. Anything outside of that, then it's just not effective. You might be effective in comparing contrast to what you think, but you can always do better with more individualized approach to coaching. Everything has to be measured, as we discussed with the sourcing and interview process. This means each step of the people process must be deliberate and tracked. Keep track of your one-on-one dialogues with each employee. Keep track of your team's success by measuring the engagement of the team in a structured quarterly review process, at least quarterly. Protect the confidentiality of the individual players, but use actual performance metrics in your coaching conversations. Naturally, it's human nature that we look at other people on our team to see where we stand. This is an opportunity for you to put the blinders on in regards to everyone else's performance and dialing in and focusing with laser precision the behaviors that are needed in order to get your employee to the next level. Quarterly staffing reviews. So the process, you heard me saying quarterly staffing review. So use measurable performance metrics for both how well they support the company culture as well as how well they do their job. Okay, so there's the two sides that we discussed. The goal is to move individuals to your top box, and the operative word is performance. Perform their job well and be a model employee as it relates to your culture and values. It doesn't matter how skilled someone is in their skill set. If they're just rotten to be around, if they don't play nice in the sandbox and they're an energy vampire, you're better off without them. And this goes for even the most celebrity of chefs, the most dramatic of personalities. It doesn't matter if they're not playing well with the rest of the team. So the end game that we're talking about here, this is what we're getting to. It's the measuring the effectiveness of the structured people process. So many companies have an opinion survey. Larger, more robust workforces, they have it dialed in professional surveys to measure the employee and guest engagement specifically. That's what they do. And you know, a lot of the people I work with in the industry, some say that employee opinion surveys are useless. Others say that they're vital. I would venture to say that they're certainly not useless, but they're not as effective if they're not used to measure success over given periods of time. If you just do it once, then it's a temperature check. What are you going to do with that data? Because you already know, regardless of the company, that you're going to score lower in. I have a trusting relationship with my boss. I have the tools to do my job. There's effective communication. Actually, if we look right here, I think I do have an engagement survey. Okay. So here's an example of an engagement survey and some of the types of questions that are indicators. One of my favorites is the same as with guest service. Would a guest recommend your property to someone else? Well, it's no different than with our workforce. I've encouraged someone to apply to work at your workplace. That's a huge indicator in regards to the culture. If you're recommending family and friends to work with you, then it's got to be great, right? Based on I would recommend someone to join on the team based on my workplace relationships. Very important. Another one has to do with maximizing their talents and strengths. They should feel a great deal of pride. Also, another good one is the team strives to achieve excellence. I'm highly energized by my workforce, or the team I work with. Those are all important indicators. Many companies utilize off-the-shelf programs like SurveyMonkey. That's fine, does the same thing. Some companies have proprietary systems. Larger companies have their own metrics of measuring employee engagement. Some companies have nothing to offer, and they suffer. It's sad. They don't even care to ask. Some companies do all the right things, but they don't get to see the most important indicator of the success, which is balancing that scorecard. So you might feel and actually know that you're working at a great company, but you have to have numbers or ways to push it even better and to make sure that you're not sliding backwards in any of these areas. So even if your culture is admittedly strong, how do you measure the subtle changes in this engagement, and how do you celebrate successes without measurement? What are you risking to lose? Using a quarterly staffing review process helps mitigate the risk of not measuring engagement in an anonymous survey. Also, completing your one-on-one dialogues will help. And don't forget about the importance of onboarding. If you complete these processes, I can assure you that you're moving your engagement needle in the right direction. But again, you have to actually score it to know if you're making an improvement. So even if you're not doing that, if you do the first things, you're moving the needle. So as we talk about this balanced scorecard, after and only after the people process is a well-oiled machine. And I have to remind you, when you're on task force or opening a new property, that you still have to do the people process. It's the first questions asked. Who's going to be the executive committee? Who's going to be the general manager, chief engineer? It all starts with the people process when you're actually getting the operation off the ground. After the people process is a well-oiled machine, the other pieces will fall into line with a little adjustment, patience, and teamwork, right? The people process, we're looking at the change in score over time. It's the same thing for the financial process. The sustainability of the organization is in your team's hands, in your hands. Make sure that they know how they're impacting the company growth. And the more trust that you have in your team, the more you can talk about financials in a way that they understand. Guest advocacy. Again, the bonus here is that if you have the right people in the right seats on the bus and they're managing their revenue and expenses properly, There's going to be positive causal relationships and overall guest satisfaction. I promise. So the bottom line of what we're looking at here is that the people process drives your overall success. Invest in people first and foremost and watch your department grow exponentially. Thanks for listening.